When Captain David Blackwell became the Coast Guard's most decorated maritime commander, sailors trusted him to protect America's coastlines. But when his opioid addiction and human smuggling schemes consumed him, he began trafficking illegal immigrants for cartels and murdering crew members who discovered his crimes, turning patrol boats into floating death traps. Before starting the video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Now, let's get back to the video. The Atlantic Ocean stretched endlessly beyond Cape Cod's Coast Guard station as Captain David Blackwell organized falsified patrol logs and cartel communication devices for what would become the most dangerous maritime operation of his 21-year career as the Northeast's most experienced Coast Guard commander and maritime security specialist. At 57 years old, David had established himself as the Coast Guard's premier maritime leader, controlling coastal patrol operations and international water coordination that attracted human trafficking organizations, drug cartels, and organized crime syndicates who valued his access to maritime routes and his reputation for coordinating the most secretive coastal security operations affecting border protection and international maritime law enforcement. David's captain quarters occupied the command center of the USCGC Vigilant, featuring classified navigation systems, international communication equipment, and maritime coordination facilities that allowed him to oversee the Coast Guard's most sensitive Atlantic operations, while maintaining absolute control over coastal patrol activities worth millions and international cooperation programs affecting maritime security and border protection throughout the eastern seaboard's vast territorial waters. The interior of David's command quarters reflected his mastery of maritime operations and his understanding of Coast Guard expectations for both security excellence and absolute discretion during the most critical maritime decisions affecting America's coastal defense, featuring walls displaying maritime commendations from multiple administrations, photographs of successful rescue operations, and testimonials from grateful Coast Guard personnel whose careers had advanced through his command expertise and strategic guidance affecting maritime security and international cooperation. But beneath David's reputation for maritime excellence lay a dangerous combination of prescription opioid addiction, systematic human trafficking, and calculated murder that had transformed his Coast Guard operations into criminal enterprises where threatening crew members and suspicious investigators met their fate through maritime accidents and witness elimination during vulnerable patrol operations. "Good morning, Captain Blackwell," said Lieutenant Sarah Rodriguez, arriving for her weekly operations briefing about ongoing patrol missions and federal coordination requirements that required David's authorization for maritime activities and international cooperation affecting Coast Guard coastal security. Sarah had recently discovered irregular patrol patterns and had begun questioning David's explanations about operational protocols that seemed to bypass normal Coast Guard oversight processes and maritime law enforcement standards. "Good morning, Lieutenant Rodriguez," David replied with the maritime authority and Coast Guard expertise that had made him legendary among Atlantic Fleet personnel, who viewed him as both naval commander and security specialist, capable of maintaining coastal protection through sophisticated patrol coordination and strategic international cooperation affecting maritime law enforcement throughout territorial waters and international shipping lanes. Sarah had become David's most dangerous subordinate, not because of her demanding operational requirements or her international coordination responsibilities, but because of her recent discovery of unauthorized patrol deviations and her growing awareness of the trafficking operation that David had been conducting while supposedly providing legitimate Coast Guard command for maritime security operations and coastal protection programs. What Sarah didn't know was that David had been systematically trafficking humans and murdering Coast Guard personnel for over 3 years, using his captain authority and access to patrol vessels to coordinate international smuggling operations while eliminating anyone who discovered his trafficking activities or threatened to expose his criminal exploitation of Coast Guard resources for cartel coordination and human trafficking networks. David's transformation from respected captain to calculating killer had begun 5 years earlier, when his prescription opioid addiction had escalated from legitimate pain management following a maritime rescue injury to daily dependency that consumed his substantial captain's salary and forced him into relationships with human trafficking cartels who offered enormous payments for Coast Guard cooperation in smuggling operations, targeting vulnerable immigrants seeking illegal entry into American territorial waters. His addiction cost over $3,000 per day, while his access to Coast Guard patrol vessels and maritime routes provided unprecedented opportunities for coordinating human trafficking operations that generated millions through cartel organizations seeking secure transportation for illegal immigrants and drug smuggling activities affecting international maritime borders and coastal security operations. His criminal activities escalated when several Coast Guard officers and maritime oversight personnel discovered evidence of unauthorized patrol activities and threatened to report their suspicions to Coast Guard headquarters and federal law enforcement agencies investigating human trafficking patterns, targeting maritime law enforcement and coastal security operations. David murdered his first victim, a suspicious Coast Guard investigator who detected irregular patrol logs, by orchestrating a man overboard accident using cartel assets that appeared to be maritime operational casualty rather than premeditated assassination designed to protect trafficking operations. The success of his first murder convinced David that eliminating threatening Coast Guard personnel and suspicious oversight investigators was both necessary for protecting his trafficking operation and achievable given his complete captain authority and his ability to coordinate with cartel networks who could stage maritime accidents and eliminate witnesses while providing plausible cover stories involving operational hazards and maritime rescue dangers. Over the following 3 years, David murdered 8 additional individuals using various maritime methods and cartel coordination that took advantage of his captain authority, his access to trafficking networks during vulnerable patrol operations, and his ability to stage deaths as maritime accidents or cartel targeting that occurred during routine Coast Guard activities with personnel who had access to sensitive information that could expose human trafficking operations. His victims had been carefully selected based on their discovery of his criminal activities, their potential cooperation with Coast Guard authorities, or their knowledge of patrol procedures that could expose his cartel coordination and systematic trafficking of illegal immigrants affecting maritime security oversight and federal law enforcement cooperation. His victims included Petty Officer Patricia Williams, a Coast Guard communications specialist who had discovered evidence of systematic patrol manipulation and whose vessel consultation had resulted in fatal equipment accident staged by cartel assets during routine maritime operations. Ensign David Foster, who had reported suspicious patrol activities and whose Coast Guard briefing had ended in fatal diving incident using equipment sabotaged through trafficking networks. And Agent Jennifer Martinez, a federal maritime security investigator who had been tracking human trafficking and whose patrol vessel inspection had resulted in fatal exposure to concentrated drugs disguised as maritime equipment contamination, affecting federal oversight of Coast Guard operations. The human trafficking operation had become extraordinarily sophisticated, with David coordinating the systematic transportation of illegal immigrants through carefully planned patrol route modifications that avoided federal detection while providing secure passage for cartel smuggling operations affecting international maritime borders and coastal security monitoring. Nighttime patrol operations served as primary trafficking transportation activities, with David personally coordinating the interception and transfer of illegal immigrants from cartel vessels to Coast Guard patrol boats that transported smuggling victims to secure landing sites along isolated coastlines where federal immigration enforcement was minimal and detection was practically impossible. The most disturbing aspect of the operation was the systematic exploitation of vulnerable immigrants seeking asylum and economic opportunity, with David coordinating with cartel organizations to identify trafficking victims who could be transported through Coast Guard operations and then forced into labor trafficking and sexual exploitation throughout American cities and agricultural areas. Multiple immigrant families had been trafficked through David's Coast Guard operations and subsequently disappeared into forced labor networks, with men forced into agricultural work and construction, while women and children were trafficked into sexual exploitation and domestic servitude throughout trafficking networks operating in major metropolitan areas. Captain Blackwell, I need to discuss serious concerns about human trafficking and reports of patrol manipulation connected to your Coast Guard operations, said FBI Special Agent Maria Torres of the Bureau's Human Trafficking Division, arriving at David's vessel carrying federal warrants to inspect his patrol procedures and interview him about suspicious maritime activities. Special Agent Torres specialized in investigating maritime human trafficking and had developed expertise in recognizing patterns of patrol manipulation and trafficking coordination affecting Coast Guard operations throughout coastal territories. Special Agent Torres's investigation represented an existential threat to David's criminal operation, as her federal trafficking expertise and access to maritime crime databases could expose the systematic human trafficking operations and connect him to multiple suspicious deaths during Coast Guard activities and patrol vessel meetings affecting federal oversight and maritime law enforcement cooperation. Special Agent Torres: I think there may be some misunderstanding about complex maritime operations and the unfortunate reality that Coast Guard personnel sometimes experience operational casualties despite advanced safety protocols and federal coordination measures, David said, while discreetly activating a concealed emergency beacon that would summon corrupt crew members who were part of his trafficking network for emergency elimination of federal law enforcement threats. Perhaps we could discuss these concerns in our navigation facility, where I can demonstrate the patrol procedures that might explain these tragic maritime accidents. Coast Guard operations involve dangerous maritime conditions that might appear suspicious to those unfamiliar with coastal security work and international maritime law enforcement affecting territorial water protection. Special Agent Torres agreed to examine David's patrol procedures, not realizing that the captain was leading her to a secure facility where previous murders had been committed and where David planned to coordinate her elimination using cartel assets while staging the scene as federal agent targeting that occurred during trafficking investigation, providing cover for her elimination while appearing to be cartel retaliation rather than deliberate murder by a captain protecting his smuggling operations. But David's carefully planned murder of the federal agent was about to be prevented by the unexpected arrival of Coast Guard oversight officers who had been investigating maritime security irregularities and had identified connections to his systematic trafficking activities affecting patrol operations and federal maritime cooperation. Coast Guard Inspector Michael Santos had been conducting comprehensive investigation into maritime trafficking and patrol corruption that exploited captain authority to facilitate human smuggling and eliminate potential witnesses to trafficking operations affecting Coast Guard oversight and federal maritime law enforcement cooperation. Inspector Santos specialized in investigating Coast Guard crimes and had developed expertise in tracking maritime operations that compromised coastal security while conducting systematic elimination of threats to trafficking operations affecting patrol activities and maritime operational security. The Coast Guard investigation had been initiated by reports from multiple maritime oversight agencies and trafficking task forces who noticed patterns of suspicious patrol modifications and Coast Guard personnel deaths, suggesting cartel networks were infiltrating maritime operations to facilitate human smuggling while eliminating witnesses through sophisticated methods disguised as maritime accidents. Captain David Blackwell, I'm Inspector Santos with Coast Guard Oversight, he announced as he entered the navigation facility where David was coordinating Special Agent Torres's elimination. I have federal warrants for your investigation on charges of systematic human trafficking, maritime corruption, patrol manipulation, and multiple counts of first-degree murder related to your exploitation of Coast Guard authority for criminal operations affecting maritime security and federal cooperation. David's reaction to the Coast Guard oversight intervention was desperate attempts to maintain his maritime credibility, as he realized that federal agents and Coast Guard investigators had been investigating his trafficking activities and connected them to systematic Coast Guard personnel murders and cartel coordination affecting maritime operations. Special Agent Torres looked stunned as she realized how close she had come to being murdered by the captain she was investigating for human trafficking. Her federal investigation had not only exposed David's trafficking and murder operation, but also prevented her own death at hands of a killer using Coast Guard authority as cover for systematic elimination of federal agents and trafficking investigation threats. The comprehensive investigation that followed David's arrest revealed the full scope of his criminal enterprise and sophisticated methods he had developed to exploit captain authority for systematic human trafficking and murder. Forensic analysis of David's Coast Guard operations revealed extensive evidence of his trafficking activities, including sophisticated communication systems for coordinating with cartel organizations, detailed records of human smuggling worth millions, and comprehensive files containing patrol information that had been manipulated to facilitate trafficking operations and avoid federal detection, affecting maritime security oversight and law enforcement cooperation. The investigation uncovered David's connections to international human trafficking cartels who had been coordinating maritime smuggling and Coast Guard corruption operations while using his captain access to transport illegal immigrants and eliminate witnesses through sophisticated methods disguised as maritime accidents and operational casualties affecting Coast Guard personnel and federal investigators. Most disturbing was discovery of David's detailed knowledge of maritime security systems and trafficking operational methods, which he had used to develop increasingly sophisticated approaches for smuggling humans while eliminating Coast Guard personnel who discovered his trafficking operations or threatened to expose his cartel coordination activities affecting coastal security and federal maritime law enforcement cooperation. Captain David Blackwell was ultimately convicted of 9 counts of first-degree murder, systematic human trafficking, maritime corruption, patrol manipulation, conspiracy with criminal organizations, and numerous other charges related to his exploitation of Coast Guard authority for criminal operations affecting maritime security and federal cooperation. The conviction sent unprecedented shockwaves throughout Coast Guard headquarters, prompting immediate reforms in maritime oversight, patrol monitoring, and captain addiction prevention measures designed to protect coastal security from exploitation by corrupted maritime officials involved in trafficking activities. Several other Coast Guard captains and maritime officials were investigated for similar criminal activities, resulting in enhanced oversight of patrol operations and new requirements for route verification, security monitoring, and federal cooperation measures, making it difficult for cartel networks to exploit Coast Guard authority for systematic trafficking operations. Special Agent Torres and Inspector Santos received recognition for their collaborative investigation and became specialists in maritime crime investigation, developing new techniques for identifying trafficking operations and protecting coastal security from exploitation by corrupted Coast Guard officials. Lieutenant Sarah Rodriguez and other surviving Coast Guard personnel required extensive security review and psychological counseling to overcome trauma of learning that their trusted captain had been systematically trafficking humans and murdering crew members while exploiting his authority for cartel activities. The case prompted comprehensive changes in Coast Guard regulation, including mandatory federal oversight and addiction screening for captains with patrol authority, enhanced monitoring of maritime operations and route planning, real-time federal supervision of coastal security activities, and new reporting procedures for suspicious maritime activities involving trafficking violations. David's conviction led to increased cooperation between Coast Guard oversight agencies and federal organizations investigating human trafficking, with new protocols designed to identify maritime systems that might be exploited for systematic criminal activities while eliminating witnesses to maritime corruption and federal law violations. 5 years after David's conviction and life imprisonment, Coast Guard operations continued implementing safeguards designed to protect maritime security from captains who might abuse their positions for criminal purposes, affecting coastal protection and federal cooperation. The captain, who had promised to protect American coastlines and maintain maritime security, had instead used his Coast Guard authority to commit systematic human trafficking and murder while exploiting maritime resources for cartel coordination, threatening foundations of coastal security and federal maritime law enforcement. Captain David Blackwell's final voyage had been permanently concluded by comprehensive investigation of Coast Guard and federal justice, where he would serve multiple life sentences without possibility of parole, proving that even maritime officials who attempted to exploit their coastal authority for criminal gain could be identified, investigated, and brought to justice when dedicated federal agencies worked together to protect maritime security from predatory Coast Guard corruption. The captain's final voyage had ended with his permanent removal from maritime service, serving as lasting reminder that those entrusted with coastal protection must never abuse that sacred responsibility, and that Coast Guard officials who would exploit maritime trust and operational authority for criminal gain will ultimately face full consequences of their betrayal of maritime integrity and coastal security. Thank you very much for listening. Please let us know what you think of this story in the comments. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications so you don't miss any other videos.